this episode, we focus on something that sounds non-technical at first, but decides whether any data or AI work succeeds in the real world, which is alignment to business needs. Beginners often imagine that the job is to build a model and then hand it off, but in practice, the most common failures happen earlier, when the project is aimed at the wrong problem or measured in a way that cannot prove value. Alignment is about translating a business goal into something that data can support, then choosing metrics, requirements, and guardrails that keep the work honest. When you do this well, you avoid building elegant solutions that nobody uses, and you avoid unsafe solutions that create privacy or compliance problems later. This topic also matters for cybersecurity and cloud environments because data work often touches logs, identities, devices, and user behavior, which can carry sensitive information and strict constraints. The core skill is to connect goals, measurement, and constraints into one coherent plan that stays realistic from the start. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to think about alignment is to start with the decision, not the data, because data only matters when it supports a choice someone needs to make. A business might want to reduce security incidents, speed up triage, improve customer experience, or lower operational costs. But those are high-level desires, not executable targets. Data work becomes actionable when you define what decision will be improved, such as which alerts get reviewed first, which accounts require extra verification, or which workloads need tighter access controls. Once you know the decision, you can define what success looks like in terms the business recognizes, like fewer high-severity incidents, fewer hours spent on false alarms, or faster recovery when something goes wrong. Beginners sometimes jump straight to model selection, but model selection should come after the decision and after you understand how the output will be used. In cloud security settings, a decision might also involve human review, escalation paths, and change management, so the model's role must fit into a workflow. Alignment means the output is not just accurate, but usable in a real process with real constraints. Key performance indicators, KPIs, are the most common tool for expressing success, but they are often misunderstood as a single number you chase without context. A KPI is a measurable signal that tells you whether the business is moving toward a goal, and good KPIs are specific, observable, and tied to outcomes that matter. In security analytics, examples might include mean time to detect, mean time to respond, percentage of alerts that are actionable, or rate of repeat incidents for the same root cause. The important beginner lesson is that KPIs should reflect impact, not just activity, because activity metrics can look good while real outcomes stay flat. It is easy to report that the system flagged more anomalies, but that might mean nothing if analysts are overwhelmed and true incidents are still missed. Good alignment uses KPIs as guardrails against self-deception by forcing you to measure what the business actually cares about. When you define KPIs carefully, you also make it easier to communicate progress without overselling what a model can do. Requirements are the next piece, and they should be treated as a contract between what the business wants and what the system will reliably provide. Requirements include functional needs, such as what the output must contain and how it will be delivered, and non-functional needs, such as latency, reliability, and explainability expectations. Beginners sometimes treat requirements as paperwork, but requirements are what prevent endless rework and misunderstandings later. If a model output is needed in near real time for alerting, that creates different design choices than if the output is used once per day for reporting. If stakeholders require reasons for decisions, that shapes what model families are acceptable and how you will explain results. In cloud environments, requirements also include integration realities, such as what data fields are consistently available, how often data refreshes, and what happens when telemetry is missing. Alignment means you write requirements that are measurable and testable, not vague promises like the model should be accurate. A requirement that can be tested becomes a safety rail that keeps the project grounded. A common beginner pitfall is letting the KPI become the goal, which leads to optimizing the metric rather than optimizing the outcome. This is sometimes called gaming the metric, and it can happen accidentally when teams focus on what is easy to measure. If you measure success by reducing alert volume, one way to succeed is to raise thresholds until almost nothing alerts, but that can increase risk. If you measure success by increasing detection rate on a particular dataset, one way to succeed is to learn dataset artifacts that do not exist in production, which creates a model that looks strong but fails when deployed. Alignment requires you to pair KPIs with countermetrics that prevent harmful shortcuts, such as tracking both false positives and false negatives, or measuring workload impact alongside incident outcomes. In security contexts, the cost of a miss can be high, so you need to make trade-offs explicit rather than pretending one number can capture everything. This is where stakeholder expectations must be managed carefully, because leaders may ask for a single scorecard number, but safe systems need balanced measurement. A mature alignment approach is honest about trade-offs and uses metrics to illuminate them rather than hide them. Another part of alignment is defining the population and scope, because unclear scope causes projects to drift into messy, untestable territory. You need to know which users, systems, regions, and time periods the solution is intended to cover, and where it is explicitly not intended to operate. In cloud security, scope might include only production workloads, only certain identity providers, or only endpoints managed by a specific policy. The dataset you have may not represent the dataset you want, and if you ignore that mismatch, your model will be optimized for the wrong world. Beginners often assume that more data sources automatically improves performance, but adding sources can introduce inconsistent semantics, missing fields, and privacy constraints that outweigh the benefit. A clear scope also makes requirements and KPIs meaningful because you know what universe you are measuring. When scope is not defined, metrics become slippery because performance can appear to improve simply by changing what you include. Alignment means you lock down scope early enough to measure honestly, while still allowing controlled expansion later. Privacy is not a separate topic from alignment, because privacy constraints can change what data you are allowed to use and what claims you can responsibly make. Privacy concerns include collecting more data than necessary, retaining data too long, combining datasets in ways that re-identify individuals, or using data for purposes that were never disclosed. In security monitoring, this is especially sensitive because logs may include usernames, device identifiers, location signals, and detailed behavioral traces. Beginners sometimes think privacy is only about removing names, but many datasets can still identify people indirectly through unique patterns, and that risk increases when you aggregate sources. Good alignment uses data minimization, meaning you collect and use only what is needed to achieve the defined goal, and you design features that reduce sensitivity where possible. Privacy also affects output, because a model explanation might reveal more about a person than is appropriate, even if the underlying decision is legitimate. Aligning to business needs includes aligning to privacy principles so the solution is acceptable to users, legal teams, and auditors. If you treat privacy as an afterthought, you risk building something that cannot be deployed. Compliance constraints are the formal rules that make privacy and governance enforceable, and they matter because they shape what you must do, not just what you prefer to do. Compliance can include laws, industry regulations, and internal policies, such as retention limits, access controls, audit requirements, and restrictions on cross-border data movement. In cloud environments, compliance often intersects with multi-tenant architecture and vendor responsibilities, which means you must know who controls the data, who can access it, and how it is protected. Beginners sometimes think compliance is only a checklist at the end, but compliance affects design choices from the beginning, like where data is stored, how it is masked, and what logging is permitted. A model that requires data you are not allowed to collect is not a model that can ship, no matter how accurate it is. Compliance also influences monitoring and documentation, because you may need evidence of how the model was trained, what data it used, and how decisions can be reviewed. Alignment means you bring compliance requirements into the same conversation as KPIs and functional requirements, so you do not discover late that the project violates a constraint. One of the most practical alignment moves is to translate constraints into concrete design rules that are easy to follow. For example, A privacy rule might mean certain identifiers cannot be used as features, or that data must be aggregated to a time window that reduces re-identification risk. A compliance rule might require encryption at rest, restricted access to training datasets, and an audit trail of who accessed what. Even at a conceptual level, you can see how these rules shape what modeling approaches are feasible, because some models and workflows require repeated access to raw data, while others can operate on anonymized summaries. In security analytics, you might also need to restrict model outputs, such as limiting explanations that could reveal sensitive operational details or user behavior beyond what is necessary. Beginners often underestimate how much these constraints shape the project, but aligning early prevents painful rewrites. When constraints are written clearly, they also help the team make faster decisions, because the guardrails are known. Alignment is not only about goals, it is about building within the boundaries that keep the work lawful and trustworthy. Another alignment challenge is dealing with multiple stakeholders who want different things from the same system. Security teams might want high recall to catch more threats, operations teams might want fewer alerts to reduce workload, and business leaders might want measurable improvements in risk and cost. If you try to satisfy everyone with a single vague objective, you often satisfy nobody. A better approach is to define primary and secondary goals and to agree on how trade-offs will be handled, such as choosing a threshold that meets a review capacity target while preserving acceptable detection coverage. This is where KPIs can conflict, and that conflict needs to be made visible rather than hidden. For example, improving detection might initially increase alert volume, and that could be an acceptable transitional cost if it leads to fewer incidents later. Beginners sometimes fear these conversations, but alignment requires them, because the model will enforce trade-offs whether you discuss them or not. In cloud security, stakeholder agreement also supports governance, because it clarifies who owns decisions when the model is wrong. Alignment is as much about social clarity as it is about technical design. A crucial part of aligning data work is defining what the model output will trigger, because output without action is just a report. If the output is a risk score, you must define what ranges of scores correspond to which actions, such as automated blocking, step-up verification, or human review. If the output is a cluster assignment, you must define what analysts should do with each cluster, such as treat it as a baseline behavior profile or use it to detect outliers within a group. If the output is a prediction, you must define who is accountable for the decision and how disputes are handled. This is where beginner misunderstandings often appear, because it is tempting to assume the model's output is the decision itself. In responsible systems, the model output is evidence, and the decision process includes rules, context, and sometimes human oversight. In security operations, that separation is especially important because automated decisions can have high impact, like locking accounts or blocking access. Alignment means designing the decision flow so that model uncertainty is handled appropriately and so that the business can live with the consequences of automation. Data alignment also requires you to consider the life cycle, because business needs and constraints do not stay still. A model that is aligned today can become misaligned when the business changes priorities, when new products launch, or when security policies shift. Drift in behavior can cause KPI impacts to change, and new compliance rules can change what data is permissible. Beginners sometimes think a project ends when a model is deployed, but deployment is often the beginning of continuous alignment work. That includes revisiting KPI definitions, validating that requirements still fit reality, and checking whether privacy and compliance controls still match the data flows. In cloud security, lifecycle alignment can include changes in logging formats, identity platforms, and workload patterns that alter what features mean. If you do not revisit alignment, you can end up optimizing an outdated target or using a model that no longer reflects the environment. A good alignment mindset treats the system as a living component of business operations. Documentation is part of alignment because it preserves decisions and makes governance possible, especially when teams change or when audits happen. Clear documentation should capture the business objective, the chosen KPIs, the scope, the data sources, and the privacy and compliance constraints that shape design. It should also capture what the model is not intended to do, which is often more important than what it is intended to do, because it prevents misuse. Beginners sometimes think documentation is only for formal compliance, but it is also for technical sanity because it prevents the team from forgetting why certain choices were made. In security-related contexts, documentation supports accountability because it helps explain why the system behaved as it did and what assumptions were in place at the time. Documentation also supports stakeholder expectations because it gives you a consistent story to tell about what the system provides and what it does not promise. Alignment is easier to maintain when the project's purpose and boundaries are written down clearly. Without that record, alignment turns into a moving argument rather than a shared plan. To bring everything together, aligning data work to business needs is the practice of connecting decisions, measurement, and constraints into one coherent design that can actually be used. KPIs define what success looks like, requirements define what the system must deliver, and privacy and compliance constraints define what the system is allowed to do and how it must be governed. Thoughtful alignment avoids metric gaming by pairing goals with countermetrics and by making trade-offs explicit, especially when security risk and operational workload collide. It also avoids deployment failure by defining scope, actions, and accountability so model outputs become responsible decisions rather than isolated numbers. In cloud security settings, alignment is inseparable from trust because data is sensitive, environments drift, and stakeholders need clarity about limits. When you can explain how KPIs, requirements, privacy, and compliance fit together, you demonstrate that data work is not just modeling, but disciplined decision support within real-world boundaries. That is the mindset that makes AI projects durable, defensible, and genuinely valuable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.